Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch with me, your host Vikas Swarup. Leaders of the Quad nations met in Tokyo on May 24 in what has been described as one of the most important meetings in recent years that will affect the geopolitics and security of the Indo-Pacific region. So, in this week's episode, we will focus on the Quad and what it means for the broader evolving security architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. The Quad is short for Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, an informal strategic forum comprising 4 nations: the United States of America, India, Australia, and Japan. The forum is intended to promote economic and security cooperation among the 4 countries which share the values of freedom, democracy, and rule of law. One of the primary objectives of the Quad is to work for a free, open, prosperous, healthy, and an inclusive Indo-Pacific region anchored by democratic values and unconstrained by coercion. The origins of the Quad can be traced back to the December 2004 earthquake and subsequent tsunami in the Indian Ocean, when India conducted relief and rescue operations for itself and neighboring countries and was later joined by the US, Japan, and Australia. The idea of a more permanent forum bringing together these 4 countries was first suggested by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who during his 2006 election campaign envisioned a grouping between the 4 democracies based on mutual interests to tackle challenges in the Indo-Pacific. The first meeting of the Quad was held on the sidelines of the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting in the Philippines in May 2007 and also had a maritime element whereby the 4 countries, along with Singapore, conducted a naval exercise. However, strong opposition from China and subsequent differences amongst members resulted in the group remaining largely dormant for 9 years before it was revived under President Donald Trump. Foreign ministry officials from the 4 countries met in November 2017 at the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in the Philippines. The first ministerial level meeting of the Quad was held in September 2019, and the first summit was convened by President Joe Biden virtually on March 12, 2021, soon after he took office, which resulted in the launch of a Quad Vaccine Experts Group, a Quad Climate Working Group, and a Quad Critical and Emerging Technology Working Group. Since then, the Quad has met at summit level in person in September 2021 at the White House, virtually in March 2022, and now in person again in Tokyo. Speaking at the Tokyo summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi described the Quad as a force for good that is ensuring peace, prosperity, and stability in the Indo-Pacific through increased coordination in many areas such as vaccine delivery, climate action, supply chain resilience, disaster response, and economic cooperation. The Tokyo Quad Summit reiterated its support for ASEAN unity and centrality, welcomed the progress on the expansion of vaccine production at the Biological E facility in India under the Quad Vaccine Partnership, called for building partnerships for greater cybersecurity and for transparent, trusted, and reliable supply chains across the region, including in the field of critical and emerging technologies, and issued a strong condemnation of all forms of terrorism and a call for expeditiously bringing to justice the perpetrators of the Mumbai and Pathankot terror attacks. The summit also announced a number of new initiatives, such as $50 billion of infrastructure assistance and investment in the Indo-Pacific over the next 5 years, a Quad climate change adaptation and mitigation package for tangible climate action, an Indo-Pacific partnership for maritime domain awareness to help countries bolster their capabilities to respond to humanitarian and natural disasters, as also to combat illegal fishing, and a Quad fellowship that will bring 100 students from the 4 countries to the US each year to pursue graduate studies in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths fields. An Indo-Pacific economic framework was also launched in Tokyo on May 23rd, which visualizes cooperation across the region on fair trade, digital commerce, resilient supply chains, and clean energy, among other issues. To learn more about the summit and the future of the Quad, I have with me 2 outstanding experts. With me in the studio is Professor Harsh V. Pant, Vice President, Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation, who is also a Professor of International Relations with King's India Institute at King's College London. An expert on Asian security issues, He is the author of 8 books on foreign policy. And joining us from Canberra is Professor Rory Medcalf, head of the National Security College at the Australian National University. One of Australia's most renowned strategic thinkers, he founded the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute and is the author of Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region. Let me start with you, Professor Pant. Why is the Quad important to India, and why is India important to the Quad?
Well, I think both are important to each other, as your question indicates. But I think when you look at the Quad, when you look at the Indo-Pacific, when you look at the security challenges and the strategic shift in the region, you also look at India's foreign policy priorities, and you try to understand where India is going, how it wants to expand its footprint in the wider Indo-Pacific, and then you realize that there is an institutional void there. And I think India's old paradigm of operating in the region bilaterally does not give it the kind of heft that it needs there. So I think Quad allows India that role, and Quad allows India to be part of the larger governance conversations that are happening at a time when the maritime space is just about being created. And I think on the other side, there won't be any Quad without India. So in a sense, India is the innovation. India is the real interesting story in the Quad, because the 3 partners are in any case alliance partners, Australia, Japan, and the US. So India brings something new to the table. India brings this idea of issue-based coalitions, new age alliances or relationships that are shaping the institutional architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So I think Quad and India therefore need each other, and we have seen as the trajectory has evolved, how central India has been to the conceptualization and operationalization of Quad.
This allows us to now go to Professor Medcalf. The Quad joint statement declares that in our first year of cooperation, we established the Quad's dedication to a positive and practical agenda. In our second year, we are committed to deliver on this promise. How do you evaluate the Tokyo Quad Summit in delivering on that promise?
Look, on the one hand, it would be easy to say this is early days, but in fact, the Quad has mobilised quite quickly. So, of course, a lot of the activity that we're talking about, whether it's in vaccine delivery into the region, whether it's in providing scholarships to study advanced technologies in the United States, whether it's in really providing alternatives in infrastructure and investment to third countries as alternatives to Chinese influence. A lot of these are things that our countries would be doing anyway unilaterally, but it's the combination of these elements and the coordination of them that give the Quad its strength. So in that sense, the Quad is off to a very strong start as an informal institution. I also would point to a very significant diplomatic element to this, and that is the normalisation, the regularisation of the Quad as an accepted regional institution. It's no longer controversial, except maybe in one country called China, arguably in Russia as well. But in the key states of the region, the swing states for development and influence, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and others, the Quad has rapidly become accepted as a normal and benign regional institution supporting their interests in development and connectivity. That's a strong start, and the Tokyo Summit really is now the 3rd meeting of Quad leaders, the 2nd in person, in barely more than a year, really symbolises and crystallises that achievement.
As you say, both China and Russia dislike the Quad, and they conducted joint flights near Japan as the Quad leaders met in Tokyo. Now, China is also shoring up its own alliances in the region. It signed a security pact with Solomon Islands last month. Now, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is on an extraordinary 10-day visit to the South Pacific, where he is likely to cement commercial, strategic, and security ties with Pacific Island nations that could work against the interests of Australia and other Quad partners. So, could the 4th Quad Summit in 14 months end up polarizing the Indo-Pacific into 2 rival camps?
Look, the polarisation, in my view, is not the work of the Quad. If there's one country that's driving the polarisation, it is China. And don't forget that we can't, as you know, we can't any longer try to simplify this as a US-China rivalry. The Trump administration was pretty confrontational in its way, but the Biden administration is being much more inclusive. So yes, some hard choices are being forced, but those are now being forced by the accelerated and I think unbalanced way in which China is projecting its influence. You mentioned joint bomber exercises, actually with nuclear-capable bombers off the coast of Japan by China and Russia. That's a really unpleasant signal to be sending, a destabilising signal to be sending. The Chinese Foreign Minister's imperial procession through the South Pacific is actually showing China's hand early. It's saying to many small nations in this region, we essentially expect to dominate your region. You'd better get with the program. And that actually creates space for India, Quad countries, Australia and others, for example, the European Union, to begin building alternatives, to begin building a more inclusive approach to regional security that brings smaller countries along with them. So I think a year or two from now, when we look back on this phase in the development of the Quad, the choices will be made in particular by China. And it's still in China's gift, if you like, to be less confrontational. I think the Quad now is an accepted and normalised part of the regional security architecture, extending inclusive assistance to regional countries, for example, helping them to monitor illegal fishing and protect their resources. The Quad's going to, if you like, make it harder for China to continue with a confrontational stance, and I hope begin to recalculate the thinking in Beijing.
Professor Pant, India walked away from the ASEAN-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, but has agreed to join the consultations on the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. What is the significance of the IPEF and how can India contribute to it?
I think what IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, underscores is that you really cannot have a conversation on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific without having the economic part in the mix. And that's what I think, it's a belated recognition on America's part after a Trump administration withdrew from TPP. I think we are now looking at a reassessment there and perhaps a calculated move. There are pressures in American domestic politics as well, which do not allow a traditional trade pact to emerge in the region. But I think what is again happening is some kind of an innovation in the way America looks at its economic engagement. So rather than going for trade blocks, going in for this kind of a framework that has inherent flexibility is perhaps a good way of encouraging other states to join and to set the rules of the game, if you will, on economic governance. And I'm hoping that this certainly, as of now, there are 13 countries involved, correct, but it expands and becomes actually the center of economic governance in the region, because it doesn't talk simply about trade facilitation. It talks about supply chains, digital economy, infrastructure and connectivity. So it's a comprehensive economic package out there. It is for, I think, regional states now to see what's in there for them. And I think India, being a founding member of this framework, a founding partner in this framework, will certainly be at the table, the high table, to set these standards that one is hoping this economic framework would conceive.
Professor Medcalf, the recent elections in Australia were rather unusual in the sense that foreign policy and specifically Australia-China relations were in much greater focus. We remember that in 2008, Labour Prime Minister Kevin Rudd had backed away from the still nascent Quad, not wanting to be a part of a group seen as openly challenging China, which had become a powerful economic partner of Australia. Now Australia has once again elected a Labour government. What will be the approach of your new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, towards the Quad in general and China in particular?
Well, we've seen a couple of fundamental changes in Australia's politics and strategic orientation. Firstly, you're absolutely right, Vikas. It's the Australian election this year included a lot of foreign policy, a lot of security policy. It wasn't just about domestic issues. But fascinatingly, there was a very strong bipartisanship on Australia taking a strong national interest stance and protecting our national values too against Chinese coercion. The two major parties, Labor and Liberal, broadly agree with each other on this. And this is the fundamental change because, again, going back 12, 14 years to the original Quad, the short-lived Quad, while the record is sometimes debated, it is clear that that Australia was a bit reluctant under a previous Labor government to be part of the Quad. That is absolutely history. The new Prime Minister Albanese, he's not a foreign policy expert. He makes no claim to be, but he's listening to his briefings. He's reading the strategic settings, the strategic tea leaves. He's observed the affront that China has caused to Australia's national interests. And he's got off to a very strong start building relations with India, with Japan, with the United States, going to Tokyo as literally his first act as Prime Minister and saying, we support the Quad, we are with you, you can count on us. So this really is, I think, a very important development in Australian foreign policy.
Professor Pant, now many believe that the war in Ukraine, which is now in its third month, would be a stumbling block for the Quad, as India has refrained from openly criticizing Russia, while the other Quad members have not only sanctioned Russia, they have sanctioned President Putin himself. Do you think the Quad has successfully overcome that hurdle?
I think so. I think we have seen a great degree of maturity within the Quad framework, and we have seen also bilateral relationships of India not suffering because of Quad. We have seen a greater degree of understanding. India's proactive diplomacy has certainly helped in making a case for India on global platforms, and India has not been defensive about its role. India has been very upfront as to what India's national interests are and how India is going ahead with them. But I think what is the real story here is also something that I think will come again and again, that Quad is not a traditional alliance. It's a like-minded it's a coalition of like-minded countries. So at the end of the day, differences of this kind are going to be natural, and I don't think it should cause undue worry, nor should it cause pessimism, because ultimately I think the intent here for the four countries is to navigate these differences, but keeping the larger strategic picture in mind, which is what can you do about the Indo-Pacific as a collective body. And I think that's what Quad is trying to do.
Professor Medcalf, the new Quad commitment to deepen cooperation on infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific and address debt issues are seen as countering China's Belt and Road Initiative. Can Quad infrastructure financing emerge as a genuine alternative to the BRI?
I think we have to be careful in our expectations here. This is not about competing with China in the sheer volume of concrete, steel or debt that our countries will bestow on smaller nations. But I do think that the Quad will be part of a web of alternatives that developing nations will be able to choose from. I would bring Europe into this picture as well. And I think that if we're strategic about it, if we identify particular projects, particular areas of connectivity or technology, I think digital in particular, and offer ourselves as setting those higher standards, then that also will in time help countries scrutinise and think twice about what China really wants. So I think we have to manage those expectations. But it is interesting if you look at the figures that Quad leaders have been pointing to, the amount of private sector investment and infrastructure support that Quad countries are beginning to unlock is accumulating quite rapidly. And if you look at the long-term stock of our support for countries in the region, for example, Japanese investment, it's even more substantial still. So this is not to be underestimated.
Professor Pant, the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness and the decision to combat illegal fishing are also seen as targeting China's unlawful activities in the Indo-Pacific. How will the countries of the region and China respond to it?
Well, I think they would not be very happy, especially China. China won't be very happy, certainly, because this shows a degree of institutionalization that if you compare Chinese initial statements about Quad, you do see that there would be divergences there in terms of Chinese expectations as to where Quad was and where it has come to. But I do think that the regional countries would find these initiatives very, very useful, because ultimately they are about providing certain kinds of public goods in the region. That if you have maritime domain awareness, or if you can manage to track illegal fishing, this is not simply one country trying to project its interests over others. This is about a collective security enterprise that the unit is undertaking on behalf of the region. So I think there is going to be a lot of positive coming out of this for various, especially for smaller countries that feel threatened by bigger neighbors, by bigger maritime powers. And here is an opportunity for Quad to demonstrate its intent that this is not about power projection. This is also about collective security and cooperative security, especially in the maritime space. Ultimately, Indo-Pacific is a maritime geography. So I think both of these initiatives are very important, and perhaps their operationalization on the ground would lead to many of the countries in the region gaining advantages from them.
Professor Medcalf, this was President Joe Biden's first visit to Asia as President of the United States. And, it was argued that one of the main messages that he wants to convey during this visit is that he can handle Russian aggression in Europe and Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific at the same time. Do you think it succeeded in that objective?
Look, I think it's been reasonably successful. If you look at the long-term implications of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and frankly, I think the disastrous blunder that's proving to be by Putin, you'd have to think that the consequences for the Indo-Pacific are not all bad. I mean, we are seeing now countries in this region recognise the dangers of armed aggression. We're seeing intensification of US commitments, US alliance commitments. And even if Mr. Biden has perhaps stumbled a little in the way he articulates America's commitment to Taiwan, I think the underlying message is absolutely clear, and he's going to make China think twice. And if you expand that vision even further and think, well, Europe is now mobilising to protect its own interests much more formidably in Europe, then you could argue that in time that's actually going to free up the United States somewhat to do more in the Indo-Pacific. So at the very least, the Biden administration is holding the line. We obviously still want to see a real commitment to American military modernisation and to the economic side of American commitment to the Indo-Pacific, and I think we're beginning to see that.
Now, climate change was a big issue at the Australian election. The Quad Summit has also come out with the Quad Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Package, dubbed QChamp, with mitigation and adaptation as its two themes. Can QChamp be a real champion in combating climate change?
Oh, I think it's early to judge that. I mean, I think in this country, Australia, we have to look initially at the politics and the rhetoric of climate change before we move to the hard policy outcomes. We have had an election in this country where a new government, the Labor government, has won office with quite a strong crossbench of independents and Greens. So the mood has shifted in Australia rapidly. Australia is going to become much more progressive on the climate change agenda. That not only puts Australia's aspirations much more in sync, for example, with the Biden administration, but it means that we can no longer be isolated diplomatically by China in the way it's been trying to, frankly, deceive small countries in the region that Australia is fundamentally part of the problem. So suddenly, for example, there's going to be space for much more scrutiny on China as the world's biggest emitter, as the country that's contributing most to the problems in the Pacific. Meanwhile, you're absolutely right, though. Quad countries need to move very pragmatically and quickly with their assistance to developing nations, whether it's in technology and standards, to demonstrate that we're not just talk on climate change, but I think the Quad will be part of the solution here, certainly far from the whole solution.
My final question. In March 2020, the US had convened a meeting of a so-called Quad Plus, which also included New Zealand, South Korea and Taiwan, to discuss joint responses to and cooperation on the COVID-19 pandemic. So how do you see the future evolution of the Quad? Do you think the Quad could become a formal grouping with a secretariat or expanded in the future to include countries such as France or the UK? Professor Pant, you want to go first?
Yes, I would hope that that Quad first consolidates itself, because there are traditional institutions aplenty, and we know that most of them are dysfunctional at this point. Because Quad is an innovation on a traditional understanding of what a multilateral institution should look like, or a plurilateral institution in this case. I think I would hope that if Quad can deliver on substantive commitments that it has projected, that would enhance its credibility, and that would make it it attractive in any case for other countries who may want to join in various capacities. So we don't need to go in a traditional sort of a format where you end up with a secretariat and expand it. But I think it becomes a much more flexible platform where countries can also adapt and come to Quad as a partner on specific issues if they want to.
Professor Medcalf, your take on the future evolution of Quad?
Look, I would tend to agree with Harsh Pant on this point. One of the strengths of the Quad has been the informality. Now, the leaders' commitment is still at this stage the most important glue that binds the Quad. The fact that we've got 4 leaders committed, and with a change of leadership in one Quad country, or indeed, not so long ago in Japan as well, we have not seen that waver. So that continuing political commitment, first and foremost, holds it together. I would like to see a little bit of soft institutionalisation of the Quad, not a fully fledged bureaucracy by any means, but I think you can have a light touch secretariat that just helps to track commitments and ensure that we're sticking to our Quad promises. But as for the expansion to bring other countries into the club, if you like, well, I'll contradict myself there, because I think we have to be careful that we don't define the Quad as such an exclusive club that it can't play with others. But I think we can be functionally cooperative, issue by issue, in flexible ways. On some issues, let's engage with the Europeans, the EU, which is stepping up its own Indo-Pacific strategy, or with the French, more specifically in the Indian Ocean, for example. On some issues, the Quad may want to work with the South Koreans, who are becoming much more interested in the Indo-Pacific idea and much more wary about China at the moment. There may be other issues where New Zealand or individual Southeast Asian countries are the partners. And so just the fact that the Quad is now seen as a reliable core, as a kind of an archipelago of trust in this disrupted sea of mistrust in the Indo-Pacific, that's the starting point. But let's not rapidly institutionalise it. Let's not make it any kind of formal alliance arrangement. Let's keep those doors open, is my advice.
Well, thank you, Professor Pant and Professor Medcalf, for those brilliant insights. As Prime Minister Modi said in Tokyo, the scope of the Quad has become broader and the format has become really effective. The Tokyo summit has helped renew the steadfast commitment of the Quad countries to a free and open Indo-Pacific that is inclusive and resilient, and has put forth a positive agenda to bring peace, prosperity and security to the region and the world. Thank you for watching Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, good night and goodbye.